Good evening to viewers. We thank you so much for joining us in this edition of the Primetime Newscast on Equinox Television. The National Oil Refinery Sonara in Limbe Southwest region of the country now has a new general manager. Ibrahim Tabamala was this morning appointed by the board members of Sonara this morning in Limbe, like I earlier said, following orders from the Presidency of the Republic. And also in this newscast, we talk sports football, where the position of Cameroon football team continues to decline on the FIFA classification table. The country now occupies the 79th position according to the January 2013 FIFA classification. These headlines and more just in a moment. Good evening to you viewers. We thank you once again for joining us in this edition of the Primetime Newscast on Equinox Television. Like we earlier said in the headlines, we take you to Limbe Southwest region of Cameroon, where Ibrahim Tabamala has taken over from Charles Metuk as the general manager of the National Oil Refinery Sonara. The general manager was appointed during a meeting of board of directors which held this morning in that part of Cameroon. The appointment follows instructions from head of state Paul Biya. Surely shall be coming back to that in a subsequent newscast. And now the population of Buda in the west region of the country are complaining that the council agents have abandoned dirt along the streets of the town. They say the town has for days now the town has for days now remained filthy, as senior reporter Christo B tells us in the following report.
Whosoever arrives the Bambutos divisional headquarters of Buda would find it certainly difficult differentiating between vegetables for sale and waste products. This is at the market called Marché Mondial in Buda town. Both vegetables and dirt do cohabit. This is to the detriment of traders who claim that they do pay regularly for council levies. The town of Buda, which is the gateway between the west and the northwest regions, is therefore under the influence of uncleanliness, as the inhabitants difficultly have access to different quarters because of the filthy nature of the different streets. One easily counts more than a dozen heaps of waste products in the main streets of Buda town. This situation highly concerns authorities, especially communal deciders, who have so far remained indifferent to the sufferings of the populations exposed to different types of illness.
Now we take you to Bamenda Northwest region of Cameroon, where authorities of the Bamenda City Council have expressed worries on the poor or deplorable living conditions of detainees at the Bamenda Central Prison. They recently pledged their assistance to the over 500 detainees, and they were speaking as they visited the prisoners to donate them foodstuffs as well as other items. A Bamenda-based correspondent from Kenneth tells us more in the following report.
The inmates of the Bamenda Central Prison benefited food items handed to them by the Bamenda City Council through the government delegate, Mr. Vincent G. Dumu. A symbolic gesture that consists of cartons of savons, bags of rice, gallons of palm oil, cartons of fresh fish, and 100,000 francs CFA. Welcoming the donor, the superintendent of the Bamenda Central Prison, Mr. Tiwa Jonas, expressed joy and happiness to the Bamenda City Council for the concern towards ameliorating the living conditions of the inmates. Addressing the 504 inmates, Mr. Vincent G. Dumu expressed his concern in improving on the living conditions of the inmates while assuring them of continuous support. Speaking on behalf of the inmates while thanking the government delegate for the gesture, this inmate promised change among the inmates, an occasion that saw the kick-off of Mr. Vincent G. Dumu's football tournament that will last for 3 months with the championship and cup finals program on the eve of 20th May.
Meanwhile, youths in Ezeka have been called upon to get involved in agriculture so that they could make ends meet. The call was made by the Bishop for Ezeka during a mini agro-pastoral show that took place in that part of the country, and it was organized by the Ezeka Diocese. Details once again with our staff lady Annabella.
The Diocese of Iseka, in collaboration with Sodekao and some government ministries, is poised to reduce poverty in Iseka and its environs by encouraging the youth to get involved in agriculture.
Cette activité rentre dans le cadre de la mission de charité de l'Église.
La charité, on ne peut pas être chrétien sans être charitable.
Reason for the organization of this mini agro-pastoral show, where the youth were drilled on the different techniques of cocoa production and how they could successfully improve upon their living standards if they believe in the soil.
Promouvoir l'agriculture, de dire aux plus jeunes Camerounais, lancez-vous dans l'agriculture pour que le Cameroun soit un pays émergent.
The initiators of the group, Kodas Caritas, with a bishop at the helm, say the church in its charity wants to see the young people excel.
D'ailleurs, il y a quelque temps, le Saint-Père nous a dit, Dieu était charité.
The Holy Father says the church is charity, reason why she is engaged in such activities. Love is development, love is assistance, it is seeing a man upright.
L'Église s'engage dans des activités de ce genre pour essayer de mettre l'homme debout.
Adding that, agriculture remains the backbone of every society.
Un pays digne de ce nom ne pourra jamais se développer sans son agriculture. C'est l'agriculture qui fait la base du développement de tout peuple.
Now, here in the economic capital, Douala, residents around the National Petroleum Depot, commonly called the SDP, at the New Dedo area here in Douala say they are living in fear and uncertainty as a result of the presence of the fuel tank, and they say that if care is not taken, another disaster that might occur like that which happened 15 years ago in the capital city, only that was in 1996. Details with Ranibel Satowara.
This grandfather has been living near the National Petroleum Depot, commonly known by its French abbreviation SCDP, in the New Dedo area here in Douala. He says for over 40 years, they have been living in constant fear because of the dangers of such gigantic petrol tanks. Coupled with the frequent power cuts, they are exposed to more danger because they resort to the use of candles and bush lamps.
So we are living as dangerous as we can. So only God, only God. With God, all things are possible.
The residents say workers of the SCDP, in their attempts to prevent a catastrophe, organize sensitization campaigns with them frequently on how to live near a petrol depot and face its measures. The residents equally explain that the government is yet to fulfill its promise of relocating them to a safer site. This resident explains that nothing filtered from the estimate that was carried out on his landed properties in the area by administrative authorities. The locals say they really want to quit the area to stay away from a similar situation like that which transpired in Sam, in the nation's capital 15 years ago, where hundreds of people were burnt to death when a fuel tank spilled, although they still have nowhere else to move to.
And just to add that the victims of the Sam fire incident which occurred in 1996 in the capital city, and they are calling on the government to look or provide another suitable resettlement site for them to relocate, and they are complaining that the resettlement site that was allocated or provided by the government is not suitable enough for human habitation. And now let's talk sports. Football before we go. Cameroon football team has continued to decline following recent FIFA's classification. The team, according to a recent publication that is January 2013, is occupying the 79th position, while her Nigerian counterpart, who grabbed the trophy at the just ended African Cup of Nations, is occupying the 30th position, and Ivory Coast is the first African country on the list, occupying the 12th position despite the team's elimination at the African Cup of Nations that just ended in South Africa. And also the chart is headed by Spain, followed by Germany. Argentina is third, and England fourth. Italy fifth. Italy, of course, is occupying the 5th position. We shall, of course, be telling you more on that in a subsequent newscast, and that does it for this segment of the news. But Talking Point is up next. Good evening to you viewers. We thank you once again for joining us in this edition of Talking Point. Tonight we have a feminist to tell us about how to empower women, how to encourage women develop leadership qualities, and also how to encourage women become economically viable. And she is a feminist, an international feminist that is coming all the way from South Africa, Madame Noosa Daniels. Good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
So what, of course, pushed you to take concern or to be more concerned about, to take the concerns of women at heart? What pushed you?
The organization that I represent, which is called New Faces, New Voices, was founded by Graça Machel, who is a globally renowned activist for women and children's rights. But she felt that women really weren't being encouraged to be economically independent. She didn't feel, along with many women, that women were really being economically empowered and were, taking their rightful place in contributing to the economic development of this continent. And so she started New Faces, which is a Pan-African network of women in business and finance.
That is the wife of Nelson Mandela,
yes.
To be more specific.
Yes, yes, that's correct. Yes, she is.
Yes, of course, you were talking about what pushed you to look at ways of encouraging or empowering women.
Yes, and part of her motivation was really to see more women coming forward to speak on their own behalf. Hence the name New Faces, New Voices. The intention is really to amplify the faces of women and to amplify their voices and multiply their faces so that women bring forth their needs and their concerns, but primarily in the economic and financial sector. And that's where our efforts tend to be concentrated. For example, we believe very strongly that women as entrepreneurs can make a big contribution to the continent by creating jobs, by having larger incomes, which they then plow back into the country. But women face several obstacles in becoming entrepreneurs. They struggle to get access to finance, which is one of the largest constraints. In some African countries, women are not allowed to own assets, to own land, which makes it difficult for women to then have collateral. But there are other constraints as well that are not necessarily related to finances, like technical support, business management training, or even infrastructure. In Cameroon, during my visit here, I've had the opportunity to visit several women entrepreneurs who are part of the chapter in Cameroon that NFNV has established. And several of those women are running very impressive enterprises, but sometimes their businesses have been forced to grind to a halt because there's no power, there's no electricity. So you see that women face a number of obstacles, but we believe that by harnessing the economic potential of African women, we can really make an impact in accelerating and sustaining economic growth on this continent.
So when you look at the stated objective, it seems to be similar with other African countries. Like when you talk about countries like Ghana and other countries where your chapters are involved in. But Cameroon is a different country from the other African countries. Do you see Cameroon having that enabling environment that can make women economically and financially viable enough? Do you see it in Cameroon?
Well, I think the women themselves have certainly demonstrated that they can run commercially viable enterprises. But sometimes the things which prevent their businesses from growing bigger, from really going to the next level, are things which may be beyond their control. As I mentioned to you, the enabling environment in Cameroon probably has some infrastructural challenges that, if were improved, could really help boost the productivity of women. So the women themselves are quite capable. They, as I said, they're determined, they're hardworking, they're passionate about their country, they're passionate about their businesses, they want to make the difference, but they are just being held back by factors, some of which are beyond their control.
What are some of these factors, if we could be more specific here? like you already mentioned, maybe power failure, economic viability, maybe finances and
finances, certainly. I mean, if you look at studies across Africa, you know, the number one constraint that African women entrepreneurs faced is lack of access to finance. And that really cuts across the spectrum, whether you're whether you're running a small enterprise or whether you're running a large enterprise. Often the interest rates at which banks are offering lending is very, very high, or the term of the loan is very short and doesn't allow, you know, an entrepreneur sort of time to generate income to repay the loan. So there are those kinds of factors, but there are also legal constraints. In certain African countries, for example, a woman can't open a bank account without getting her husband's permission, or a woman can't inherit land. And those kinds of constraints in the external environment are as much of a constraint as let's say, finance is a constraint. And then lastly, you know, I think a lot of women entrepreneurs have determination, but don't necessarily have business training. And so being able to access business support, to get coaching, to get mentoring, those things can make a huge difference. But I found that the women of Cameroon, as I said, are strong. They're passionate about their businesses. They're extremely hardworking. They just want the opportunity to really show that they can, in fact, grow their businesses and make an important contribution to the Cameroonian economy.
So now, taking a look at maybe past statistics, it reveals that the woman, or the Cameroonian woman, or the African woman is playing a vital role as far as world food production is concerned, as well as the continental food production is concerned, from 60 to 80%, if I went through your brochure quite appropriately. So, but there's still this feeling that they are still being relegated to the background. What accounts for that? Whereas they are playing a very, very vital role as far as food production is concerned. Yes,
I mean, there's no doubt that the vast majority of the food produced on this continent is produced by women. Women do a lot of the back-breaking labor in terms of fetching wood, you know, getting water, plowing fields, walking long distances. But I think because there's a sense that women operate in the informal economy, their contribution isn't quantified. It isn't measured, it isn't valued. And as a result, there's a general perception that women's businesses are small and they're insignificant. And yes, you know, women might be busy doing things, but they're not doing significant things. They're not doing meaningful things. And I think that's a perception that needs to be changed. But one of the ways to change it is to have hard facts, is to have, you know, data that really shows what women's contribution is to GDP. You know, a lot of banks, especially microfinance banks, have found that women are better customers than men. They have a better repayment rate than men. They tend to be more loyal. They tend to have lower default rates. And I think bringing those statistics to light will demonstrate that there's a solid business case for why companies should invest in women, for why governments should invest in women. And it's important that we recognize that the contribution that women are making is not just on the margins of society. It's critical to the fundamentals and the foundations of our society.
So don't you think that it will be paramount for you to start from the periphery, where most of these women that you rightly said, they labor so much, they don't even know how, I'm talking about the rural women. They're playing a very, very vital role here, and you instead decided maybe to, first of all, begin in Douala, which is a cosmopolitan town. Don't you think it would be very important or paramount for you to get into the suburbs of the country, maybe meet those rural women who know very little or nothing about what they are doing and what they are doing to the country, their own contribution to the country's gross revenue? Don't you think so?
Well, yes, I think so. But New Faces believes in supporting women at all levels, from the women in the agricultural fields to the woman who's sitting in the boardroom of a large corporation. We think it's that all women across the spectrum need support. But I think it's really typically the SME sector, those small and medium enterprises that tend to be neglected, that struggle the most to get financing. And one thing I should explain is the way we work is through this network of chapters. And in Cameroon, we have a national chapter, which has 200 members, all of whom are entrepreneurs from diverse sectors. The chapter is led by Giselle Yitamben, who's been working with women entrepreneurs for her whole life. And it's really the chapter that determines the priorities in terms of the focus for the country. The women I met from the chapter, many of them are working in agriculture. They have agro-processing businesses. They're providing jobs in rural areas. They're doing farming. But some of those women are also working in urban areas. So it's really the women of the chapter that define the scope of the priorities that the chapter then chooses to address.
So you seem to have a good mastery of the problems that women are facing as far as maybe empowering them is concerned. So what are Cameroonian women going to benefit from your organization or your project?
What New Faces is seeking to do is really to harness the collective energy and talent of women across the continent. We know that there are many, many women's organizations that have been working for many, many years on empowering women, but sometimes they don't have a continental reach. They don't have a global reach, or even within their own countries, they find it difficult to engage with policymakers and government leaders. And because we have a woman of the standing of Mrs. Graça Machel, who has access to leaders in the African Union, in the Economic Commission for Africa, who's got access to leaders across the world stage, she's able to then provide a platform for women to come forward and really articulate their own needs and their own concerns. So we're trying to, you could call it in a way a movement. You know, we're trying to really galvanize women to begin to take their economic destiny into their own hands and to speak on their own behalves, but to engage in a very constructive way with the key stakeholders in their own environments to see how we can accelerate the economic empowerment of women.
You earlier mentioned a couple of setbacks, like maybe some women, their husbands do not permit them maybe to go forth with their businesses as well as others. So how are you planning to break these barriers?
Well, certainly I think some of the barriers require legal reforms. I think that we need to modernize some of our statutory and legal laws in order to really be current with the times. I mean, women are independent agents. They have the right to make decisions about their own economic futures. And so some of these laws can be changed very quickly. Some things that will take time, because we're talking about also changing mindsets. We're talking about changing the mindsets of individuals who maybe believe that, you know, women belong at home and women shouldn't be economically active and that it isn't a positive thing, you know, for women to be generating their own income. But I think at the end of the day, we need to recognize that if we're going to really move this continent forward, if we're going to change the destiny of Africa, and if we're going to leave a legacy behind for our children that is a more prosperous one than the one we currently have, then we need to have men and women working together, contributing, as I said, their energies, their talents,
their resources,
exactly, you know, to uplifting this continent.
Now, apart from organizations, NGOs that may come in at one point to assist women or tell them how they should be empowered, don't you think the government also has a role to play here?
Absolutely. I think governments across Africa have a big responsibility to play. And part of that responsibility is really creating that enabling environment. And that starts with education. It starts with making sure that women and girls have the same opportunities to education as men and boys do. It starts with giving women opportunities to get training that will equip them to function in the business world, including financial literacy training and business management training. But governments can also make it easier for entrepreneurs to conduct business. You know, the time it takes, let's say, to set up a business, to open a business, makes a difference. And I think that's part of the reason why you find so many African businesses and women operating in the informal sector is because it's difficult. It's difficult for them to register their businesses. Sometimes the tax environment is not favorable. Sometimes, I said, the monetary framework or the regulatory framework is not conducive to business. And those are the things that government can and should change to really allow entrepreneurs to thrive.
Thanks indeed, Madam Nomsa Daniels, and thank you so much for joining us tonight on Talking Point.
Thank you very much for having me.
And to you viewers, we have come to the end of this edition of the Primetime Newscast on ETV. We thank you so much for your keen attention. Meantime, have a wonderful stay in the company of our programs, and good evening to you all.